Hello, and welcome to Mandelson, A Homosexual History, a new special miniseries from the creators of the podcast Bad Gays. My name is Ben Miller. I'm a writer, historian, and member of the board of the Schwules Museum in Berlin.
And my name is Hugh Lemmy. I'm a writer, author, and today I am your homosexual expert on the life of Peter Mandelson.
So why are we here?
Ben, let me start with a story. We'll go back a decade or more to 2015 or so. And I'm about to take part in a panel discussion on political aesthetics and the internet in a venue in central London, discussing how social media has changed the way that many voters communicate around their politics. And the audience, perhaps unsurprisingly, given the subject, is quite small. And we're sat on a stage waiting to begin. We're getting our mics sorted, when at the back of the lecture theatre, at the top of this steep flight of stairs, a pair of double doors swing open. And there's a figure standing there looking down on us, contemplating the scene, and lit from behind so his face is obscured. And even though it was a good way up to the top of the lecture theatre seating, I immediately recognised him almost by his silhouette. He's perhaps the most influential and in some ways mysterious political figure of certainly my early life, and perhaps still almost to this day. I know him by a whole handful of epithets that define his public reputation: the éminent grise of New Labour, a 21st century Cardinal Richelieu, a practitioner of the dark arts of spin. But one nickname immediately springs to mind, and I lean into my fellow panellists and I whisper it. It's the Prince of Darkness. The Prince of Darkness is, of course, the former Labour MP, the spin doctor, the peer, the master of political communications, Peter Mandelson. At the moment, Lord Mandleson, although whether he will still be a peer when this mini-series is fully aired, we'll yet to find out. He was a figure of fun, of catty homophobic innuendo, of justifiable political anger, a figure of deep respect to some, and a model of everything that had gone wrong in British politics to others. But he became one of the most successful political power brokers that Britain has ever seen. Until recent months, he was known as a comeback kid who survived several attempts to dethrone him, several scandals where he was forced out of politics, yet he maintained a miraculous ability to rise again and again to the top. As he said from the stage at the vote count in the 2001 general election, "They underestimated me because I am a fighter and not a quitter." But in recent months, he's faced the biggest crisis of his career, as revelations from the Epstein files show that not only was he a close personal friend of Epstein, even after his convictions for child sex trafficking, but he seems to have been an important link in the wider network of illicit influence in politics, finance, and media that Epstein was at the centre of.
So that, dear listeners, is why Hugh and I have decided that one episode about Peter Mandelson would not suffice. Hugh initially told me he wanted to do a double episode, and then it kept growing and growing. And finally, we decided that this was worth a full miniseries because Hugh has managed to convince me, a Yank with a sort of passing knowledge of British politics, that Peter Mandelson may be the skeleton key to understanding how British democracy and maybe other liberal democracies whose crises we're all living through have unraveled in the past 30, 40 years under the increasing power of a network of unbelievably well-networked, unbelievably wealthy people. And I think by the end of this miniseries, you'll be convinced of the same.
Absolutely. Well, Mandelson's life and career are fascinating because they span a very transformative period in British politics, not least when it comes to issues of class, sexuality, and politics in the country. Today's episode is the first of the mini-series where we will use the life of this extraordinary political figure to discuss this period in British history. Over the next few weeks, we'll be discussing the economic transformation of Britain from a post-war social democracy to an increasingly precarious neoliberal state in which the surviving icons of the welfare state, like the NHS, cling on for dear life. We'll discuss the role of the Labour Party in both the creation and destruction of the welfare state, its historic relationship to the unions and the public, and how it transformed itself in the 80s and 90s as British society and economic orthodoxy shifted. And we'll look at the growth of Blairism, which might just as easily have been called Mandelsonism over this time, and how a decades-long split, maybe I can say a heated rivalry, has led the party to its current position. In fact, its relevance today is so clear that you can play a little drinking game, Ben, and every time I ask you if something sounds familiar, you can take a shot. There's a lot to talk about that resonates with the world we live in today. But because this is Bad Gays and not the rest is history, we'll see how all this has occurred during a massive sea change in social attitudes towards sexuality, and especially homosexuality, which pulls together so many of these threads as part of Mandelson's story. When Peter was born, when he was a teenager, homosexual sex in the UK was a criminal offence. To be publicly outed as a homosexual was a political scandal in its own right, after which a political career would be virtually impossible. But within Mandelson's lifetime, we've seen a social liberalisation in the UK, the gradual decriminalisation of homosexuality and the growth of gay liberation. And we've also seen the rise of the AIDS crisis and a social and political backlash to the increased visibility of queer people. So I want to talk about all that in the British context and look at how Mandelson's life and career has navigated these changing attitudes, ending where we are today, where Mandelson and his sparse defenders have actually been able to use his homosexuality as mitigation in an attempt to exclude him from the sexual aspects of the scandal surrounding Epstein. And by the end of this miniseries, hopefully we'll understand more, not just about Mandelson, but about the wider political history of homosexuality in the UK and abroad in his lifetime, from decriminalisation to Section 28, from sleaze to gay marriage. And it's a story of Faustian proportions, by which I mean it's a story that plays out on this massive geopolitical scale, but which at its heart is driven by very human compromises and desires, which sees one go from an early desire to change the establishment and ending up deeply committed to protecting that establishment because of the deals you're prepared to make to attain and hold political power.
That's why the story of Peter Mandelson is important beyond the borders of the United Kingdom, because there are people like Mandelson everywhere. There are Mandelson types everywhere. There's been a lot of writing, a lot of reporting, a lot of podcasting about Peter Mandelson, especially in the last several months as the scandal surrounding his involvement in the Epstein files has broken. What's going to make our approach different is all in the subtitle of this miniseries, Mandelson, A Homosexual History. Very much according to our traditional bad gays logic, we're going to focus on the specific ways in which the collaboration of homosexuality with power has shaped Mandelson's specific career in politics, has shaped his influence, and has shaped his life. And we're also going to take a very deep historical dive. Today's episode is going to almost entirely cover periods of time that aren't even mentioned in most of the writing about Mandelson, never mind gone into in any detail. But it's our contention that you need to understand the details. You need to understand the history. You need to understand the full story in order to understand what's going on now, in order to understand how he got so powerful, and in order to understand what his power tells us about how the world works today.
Yeah, I've wanted to cover Mandelson on this show for years, and it never quite seemed like the right time, partly because there's so much to talk about, but also because it always seemed there was more to come, more career, more influence, and probably more scandal. With recent news, it seems like he's now in the death throes of his political career in a scandal which one hopes it'll be impossible to bounce back from. But as we'll learn with Peter, you can never say never. But before we start, I just wanted to do a bit of housekeeping. The first is to say that, as you might imagine, of course, in later episodes, we will be discussing issues around childhood sexual abuse with relation to the Epstein case. And then secondly, a note from our lawyers that, of course, Peter Mandelson denies any allegations of illegal behaviour relating to Epstein, and that the inclusion of anyone in the Epstein files doesn't necessarily imply any illegality or even necessarily wrongdoing. So Peter's story really is the story of the Labour Party's ascendancy in Britain in the 20th century and its collapse in the 21st. It started on the 21st of October 1953 when he was born to George and Mary Mandelson in North London. George was known as Tony. And this was a Britain that was still ravaged by the Second World War. When he was born, food rationing was still in place. The country's cities and port towns were littered with bomb sites that still hadn't been cleared. But it was also a time of change and optimism. It was the year that Queen Elizabeth II was crowned, and to many it looked like the beginning of what they called a new Elizabethan era. And it was just a few years since Labour had instigated their enormous reform of British society along social democratic principles in the wake of the war. So a new National Health Service, the NHS, that was universal and free at the point of use. There was a new universal social security system, a new comprehensive education system, 1.2 million new homes, 80% of which were social housing. And this was a comprehensive reform of British society aimed at both fixing the catastrophic social conditions of the interwar period and at seeing off any attempt by communists to organise more revolutionary social change. In the words of the Conservative MP Quintin Hogg, quote, "We must give them reforms or they will give us a revolution." And those reforms came in part from Mandelson's own world. He was raised in Hampstead Garden Suburbs, which is a small neighbourhood of London between Hampstead Heath and Finchley, which was a planned suburb offering an ideal, quiet and leafy location which had become favoured by London's liberal and intellectual political elites. To understand what sort of world this was, we have to know a little bit about the post-war Labour Party, because it was a political, cultural titan at the time. It was over 1 million members, and it was completely transforming society, and those ideas were often coming from places like Hampstead Garden Suburbs. And these transformations of British society were astonishing, but they were also aimed at maintaining this careful balance between political and economic forces. So Labour consolidated industries under national ownership, but they did it in order to better manage them for reconstruction of a country that had been incredibly hardly hit by aerial bombardment and blockade. And they didn't do it to institute democratic control of industry. And so the Labour Party at the time and ever since was split between the left of the party and the right. And on the left, we had a group that was led by this towering figure of Nye Bevan, who was a former coal miner and trade union activist. And they were, in essence, democratic socialists who wished for increased democratic control of industry and for a sort of welfare reforms that were instituted by the Labour government immediately after the war. And they wanted them to be taken further. And over the years, they became very anti-nuclear proliferation, and they were looking for a much more conciliatory attitude towards the former allies, the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, on the right, we had this group led by another member of the 1945 Labour government, the Oxford-educated former academic Hugh Gaitskell. And so the Labour right believed in a mixed economy with some state control that was limiting the excesses of capitalism. But they were Atlanticists in their foreign policy. They looked towards America and they were becoming increasingly anti-communist. They were keen supporters of NATO and of a British nuclear defence programme. And as time went on, the Labour right tended more towards European integration, whereas the Labour left often tended towards Euroscepticism around increased integration of the European markets and political control. The Labour left tended towards supporting militancy within trade unions as a tool of democratic control, and the Labour right tended towards wanting to limit union power within a social contract. In general, historically and today, the Labour left has enjoyed much more support amongst Labour members, regular people who join the party, while the right has enjoyed much more support amongst Labour MPs, those who are voted into Parliament. These are obviously necessarily broad strokes to describe a fundamental ideological split within the Labour Party, and it's a split that continues till today. And I'm painting it in these broad strokes because without it, you can't really understand our man Mandelson and his later career. But one thing to realise is that these are two poles of attraction. They're not absolute factions, in between which you might find many Labour figures that take positions that might not fully be one or the other. Even Gaitskell wasn't a perfect Gaitskellite, a bit like Marx wasn't a Marxist. And Tony Benn, for example, he moved from the centre of the party to the left of the party, while Barbara Castle, who was a classic Bevanite, eventually moved much further right in terms of industrial policy. So this is the ongoing battle for control of the party, which is still happening today under Keir Starmer. Now, as well as Gaitskell and Bevan, there's a third man in this scenario, another very important figure in the post-war Labour government, in fact, in the wartime government as well, who we need to talk about. He was the deputy leader of the Labour Party, Herbert Morrison. He'd been number 2 to the Labour leader and the Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, for a decade, and he'd also been a major figure on the Labour right, and it was long assumed that he would be the heir apparent as the next Labour leader. So Morrison was waiting in the wings, hopefully, but Attlee held on and he didn't resign until 1955. At the leadership elections, Morrison, Bevan and Gaitskell all stood. And at this point, the Labour leader was chosen by MPs, not party members, and so the presence of 2 Labour right candidates looked like it was going to split the vote. However, in the end, Gaitskell managed to take the reins and became Labour leader for almost a decade. So why then do I mention this strange third figure battling for control of the Labour Party? Because Herbert Morrison was Peter Mandelson's grandfather.
So in other words, what you're telling us is that Peter Mandelson has been essentially from birth a figure in factional struggle within the Labour Party.
Absolutely. And he was born, as they say, with a red spoon in his mouth. The party was in his blood.
Red spoon from the Labour right.
From the Labour right, yes. So Herbert Morrison's daughter was Mary Morrison, who was, of course, Peter's mother. But actually, what's interesting, it'd be wrong to suggest that Peter was raised within that model because Morrison was notoriously cold with his family. He barely spent any time with Mary or her mother. And actually, they only received just a passing mention in his autobiography. He barely mentions his wife and child in his autobiography. And in fact, after Herbert Morrison got married again, his second marriage, he largely cut his daughter out of his life. So Mary, Peter's mother, had been married during the war, but the relationship had broken down. And in the aftermath of the war, she got a job in an advertising agency where she met Tony Mandelson. He was a young man who'd served the cavalry in the war, and he'd also been married and divorced. And then he'd followed in his father's footsteps to become an advertising manager at the Jewish Chronicle, which is Britain's main Jewish newspaper, and in fact, I think the oldest Jewish newspaper in the world. In 1949, they had a son, Miles, and 4 years later, Peter, whose name was chosen by Miles. He was named after the Beatrix Potter character, Peter Rabbit. Though they were deeply involved in the Jewish community through his work on the Chronicle, they were not religious at all. And in his memoir, the fittingly titled The Third Man, Peter Mandelson says that his first time even visiting a synagogue was for a friend's wedding when he was in his 30s. And he describes the family home as a household of 4 atheists.
Was his mother also from a Jewish family or raised in a Jewish context?
No. So his early life in Hampstead Garden suburb was full of this sort of progressive bourgeois politics and culture. His parents were both Labour members. They were very much involved in their community, and his father especially was very fond of talking politics with their friends and neighbours. Mandelson describes it as almost a religion in their house. They also didn't repeat the pattern of parental neglect that Mary had suffered, and by all accounts it was a very warm and loving home in a well-off community. The Mandelsons' neighbours and closest friends were Harold and Mary Wilson, who had 2 sons who were a little older than Peter and Miles. Harold Wilson became leader of the Labour Party in 1963 following Gaitskell's death, and in 1964 he was elected as Prime Minister. And Harold's politics in the 1950s had been left, and then he moved slowly towards a more centrist, soft left position, and he was very much a sort of unity candidate. He was bringing together parts of the left and parts of the right. And as a child, Peter was actually invited to Downing Street by Wilson, and Wilson's formidable political secretary, Marcia Williams, sat him in the Prime Minister's chair at the cabinet table and even introduced him to his grandfather's old frenemy, Clement Attlee.
In other words, Peter Mandelson is one of these terrifying Pete Buttigieg-like children who want to be president or prime minister from the time that they're 5 or whatever.
Yeah, apparently by the age of 11, he was telling his classmates that he would one day work in Parliament. And his household, of course, was so infused in politics. As I said, it was described as a sort of family religion and had an enormous effect on him despite the absence of his grandfather in his sort of day-to-day life. He studied at Hendon County Grammar School. Now, in the old education system before the war, the British education system was essentially organised by class. And if you came from a working class background, you were probably being sent to a school where you were being trained to become a manual labourer, to work in factories. You were given those sort of basic skills, and it was much more vocational. And then there were grammar schools, which tended to be for often middle class, upper working class kids, and you had to pass an exam to get into those. And then there were public schools, what we call public schools, which are actually private, where you had to pay to get into them. And in the post-war, as part of this sort of democratization of British society after the war, they were removing this system slowly and replacing it with something called a comprehensive school, where you'd get, theoretically, all the kids in a local community would go to one school, regardless of their sort of aptitude, and would be taught in the same school. And this was resisted by the headmaster of Hendon County Grammar School, who wanted to stay an old-fashioned grammar school. And at that moment, a 13-year-old Peter helped organise protests in favour of turning it into a comprehensive. Mandelson himself says, quote, "My headmaster denounced me in front of the school assembly as an industrial militant who was trying to tear apart the fabric of the school community," end quote.
If only he had stayed that way.
Exactly. Yes, and actually, as he progressed through school, he actually radicalised further to the left. At one point, he was advocating that the prefect system, which was a select group of older kids who were chosen to enforce the school rules in a very weird system that they have in the UK, he advocated that the prefect system that was selected by the headmaster was actually overthrown in favour of an elected school council, and he helped to form a union of school students. He then joined the youth wing of the Labour Party, at the time called the Young Socialists, which was in the process of being captured by an internal faction called the Militant Tendency, which was a Trotskyist group, which will become very important to the story later on. But Peter wasn't attracted to that Trotskyist faction at all. Instead, he moved with his group over to join the Young Communist League. That was the youth organisation of the Communist Party of Great Britain. So there remains a question, was Peter Mandelson ever a member of the Communist Party? It is possible, in fact it's even likely, as one purpose of the Young Communist League, of course, was to prepare young people for party membership and militancy. But he denies it, and there's no paper trail, or at least there's no paper trail within the Communist Party. There was, however, one from the British state and from MI5, the British Security Services, who closely monitored and infiltrated their organisations, and they opened a file on Mandelson's political work, and it remained open for 2 decades. And presumably there's a separate file that is still open, even if Keir Starmer didn't look at it or wasn't shown it before appointing him to be ambassador to the United States. But Mandelson's communism truly was little more than a flirtation. It lasted a year or two. Soon he was moving on into community work, and then when he'd left school, he travelled to Tanzania to work helping to establish Julius Nyerere's municipal socialist policy of Ujamaa. Julius Nyerere was an anti-colonialist, socialist activist who became the first president, I believe, of Tanzania, an independent Tanzania, and he introduced this thing called Ujamaa, which was a policy of a sort of municipal socialism based around villages and village communities. To help take this very poor country and help provide rural communities with the stuff they needed, like healthcare and education. And this seemed to have a very big effect on Peter. When he returned to take up a place at St Catherine's College, Oxford, to study PPE, politics, philosophy and economics, he commented that, quote, "I didn't feel I had much in common with all those fresh-faced undergraduates discovering class warfare for the first time," end quote. So he had dropped all interest really in Marxism and instead became very interested in big P politics, joining various groups and organisations, including the Oxford University Labour Club and the British Youth Council, and becoming very involved in administration in these organisations. And strangely, considering his later career, he claims not to have engaged in the conventional socialising of Oxford, the sort of Mayballs and the Oxford Union specifically. And I say it's strange in a way because what Oxbridge and especially Oxford offers is not just this academic side, but for students and especially students of PPE, a chance to make these connections and to build these sort of circles of friendship and influence that eventually lead to high politics at high office in the UK. So you'll recall when we talked about this a bit in our episode on Jeremy Thorpe, the Liberal leader, but past presidents of the Oxford Union include many people who will go on to feature in Mandelson's story, including the Conservative leaders William Hague and Boris Johnson, who was, of course, Prime Minister, Michael Gove, but also many on the Labour left, including Michael Foot, who would become the Labour leader in the 1980s, and Tony Benn, who we've already talked about a little. And if he was looking for a political career that was focused on high office at this point, that was the obvious route to take, but he didn't do it. So that alone makes me think that this shift towards the right was in some ways a sort of sincere political journey more than mere opportunism. But it's also worth pointing out that even at this early stage, one of the key rhetorical points of the Labour right was, and remains, that the left is motivated by this sort of out-of-touch, theoretical, bookish leftism that's the result of middle-class idealism rather than the needs of working-class people. And Mandelson's account of it was that his time in Tanzania had brought him back down to earth. But that's really a retrospective characterization, because in a letter that he sent to a friend of his who was a comrade back in the UK at the time, he said, quote, "Sometimes I feel that I'm retaining the force and commitment of my YCL, Young Communist League, bred attitudes and beliefs, but I'm just not having the opportunity to expound on them. At other times, I feel that my revolutionary ardour is fading because I'm a bourgeois at heart, that the people I enjoy most are from a strictly bourgeois and intellectual background, and that the life I enjoy most does not exactly revolve around the class struggle," end quote. So at the time, he's actually situating himself as exactly that sort of middle-class idealist that he was criticising. And indeed, I think that is a pretty good description of him throughout his life. But although he remained politically engaged, Mandelson really wasn't monomaniacal about it. He had an active social life. He had flirtations with women, although they seemed to not move too far beyond flirtations. One of his school friends from Hampstead, Karen Abbs, was close friends with a girlfriend of Peter's called Caroline Wetzler. And Caroline and Karen both went to Sussex University together and they became friends. And as she would later say, she, quote, "found out from her what hadn't happened, as it were," i.e., that's a nice way of putting it, that they weren't having sex. And incidentally, if you think that you recognise Keren's surname, Abbs, she was the niece of the Labour MP Leo Abbs, who was the key figure in passing homosexual law reform and the 1967 decriminalisation of homosexuality. And in his memoir, Mandelson also talks about a friend who he calls an exotic girl called Venetia Porter, who introduced him to the arts and the bohemian life of London, including spending time at the Colony Room, which is a club in Soho, which does raise a fascinating hypothetical because the Colony Room, of course, was the favourite drinking den of Francis Bacon, the painter. So it's hard to imagine this sort of twinky, 23-year-old mustachioed Peter Mandelson. He may well have polished off a few sherries with Francis Bacon at one point. Anyway, this shift from a flirtation of socialism towards a much more social democratic engagement in political administration served him very well. And on graduation, he got a job in the economics department of the TUC, the Trades Union Congress. He worked on youth unemployment and he produced a very well-respected report on the problem. And this was the late 1970s, which was really the peak of trade union power in the UK. At that time, union leaders were often household names and they were seen to have more power and control even than Labour ministers. The so-called Winter of Discontent in 78 and 79, where the country was hit by a series of disruptive strikes from unions campaigning for better pay, was seen as disastrous for the credibility of the Labour Party. But Mandelson was forced out of the TUC in 1978 because he'd been elected as the chair of the British Youth Council, and that was a position he represented by holding the Union Jack aloft when his delegation entered the Latin American Stadium in Havana during the left-aligned anti-imperialist, some say communist front of the World Festival of Youth and Students, where he stood with the Union Jack to hear an address by none other than Fidel Castro.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so he's a 22.
So he's moderating, and he's following this path, this sort of well-trodden path from youthful revolutionary socialism all the way through to social democracy, all the way through to selling out people to billionaires, but there's still at this point some real kind of fight left in him.
Yeah, and he's moderating. Like he wouldn't, I think at the time, would never have described himself as a sort of pro-Castro figure, but he sees that for his organization to be part of this wider sort of discourse is very important. Yeah, and it's just an amazing time for him that he's 1 week he's at the Colony Club with, I don't know, Lucian Freud and Francis Bacon, and then the next week he's flying off to Cuba with, I think he was there with David Aranovich, who went on to become an important journalist in the UK, to watch Castro give a speech. So we've zipped through his early life. Now we can get to the meat of the business. It's 1979, the year that Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, and Peter Mandelson is 25. He's living in Lambeth in South London, and he becomes a local councillor for the Labour Party. And here we get into this high point of this historic tension between the Labour left and the Labour right. So when Jim Callaghan, the Labour Prime Minister and leader, stood down in 1980 following the election of Thatcher, it was widely expected that the MPs would choose Dennis Healey, who was a veteran of the Labour right, as the leader. But they shocked the press and many Labour members by choosing instead a veteran of the Labour left, although a very sort of sympathetic character in some ways, Michael Foot, who was by this point in his late 60s. The logic was that even though he was on the left of the party, he was widely respected and a uniting figure at a time when the party really needed unity to face off against Thatcherism. But this plan didn't really work. 4 leading Labour MPs from the right, Bill Rogers, Shirley Williams, Roy Jenkins and David Owen, and these had been cabinet members and very high profile, they became known as the Gang of Four because they left the party to start a new party, the Social Democratic Party, which later merged with the Liberal Party to become the Lib Dems.
And the Liberal Party was the rump of the old British Liberal Party that had survived as a very minor force after Labour had replaced it in the party system in the early decades of the 20th century, correct?
Yes. So throughout the 20th century, you had basically a two-party system. And at the start of the century, it was Liberals and Conservatives, and then there was the rise of Labour, and then it became Labour and Conservatives, and the Liberals survived as a party, as a rump, never attaining political power, but always having an influence in politics. It was the party.
And a few MPs. Jeremy Thorpe is a Liberal?
Jeremy Thorpe, for example, yes. They were also the party, although they had a lot of stalwart members, they were also a party that sort of people voted for when they felt that the Labour Party was becoming too left or the Conservative Party was becoming too right-wing. And Mandelson, at this point, who'd been elected as a Labour councillor, he came to blows with a very left-wing council leader, a Trotskyist called Ted Knight. So he stood down as a Labour councillor because he couldn't deal with this left-wing Labour leader in the council. This gang of four went off to start the Social Democrats, and they took some support with them, some members, but a lot of the right stayed within the Labour Party to fight. And Peter was one of those, and he actually joined a group called the Labour Solidarity Group, which was this internal right-wing campaign group within the party that was founded by another Labour right heavyweight, Roy Hattersley. So there were people who were there fighting essentially for the soul of the Labour Party against the left. Hattersley himself would go on to become something of a mentor. The two men would have significant divergences, as we'll come to in later episodes, but yeah, he follows Hattersley's sort of idea of wrestling back control from the left and purging the left. And at this time, he also got a job in television. He was working for London Weekend Television as a researcher and producer, which later on had become a very useful skill as he went back into working with the Labour Party as political communications behind the scenes. So this group, the Labour Solidarity Group, run by Hattersley, would become vital when, in 1981, Tony Benn, who was a Labour left heavyweight, he challenged Dennis Healey for the position of deputy leader. So I know this sounds a lot like Labour criminology going on here, and to an extent it is, but really it's the only way of understanding the Labour Party civil war. And through that civil war, how Mandelson would rise to this position of such extraordinary power. And if you're interested in what's happening in the Labour Party today, why did they elect Corbyn? And then after Corbyn, why did they elect Starmer? And why did Starmer throw so many people out? It's this same fight going on 40 years later. Tony Benn's challenge came after this change in the internal democracy of the Labour Party, which meant that a new electoral college consisting of a union block vote, so the union gets a block vote, the parliamentary party gets a vote, and then constituency Labour parties, they all get a say. And Benn regarded that this was his best chance to pull the Labour Party leftwards, with the help of the unions, who he felt would be allies. And he outlined this plan at the 1980 Labour Party conference, and it was about nationalisation of industry, abolition of the House of Lords, and a sort of proto-Brexit, leaving the European Economic Community. And so there was a deputy leadership election, and he lost by less than 1% to Healey. So this attempt to guide the party through the way it organised its internal democracy backfired. Does that sound familiar, Ben? Take a shot?
It sounds very familiar, Hugh.
Because it's exactly the sort of thing that happened with Ed Miliband. They changed the system and Corbyn became elected. So this set the stage for the Labour Party civil war of the 1980s. Under Michael Foot, the Labour leader, the party manifesto tacked very heavily towards the left. The 1983 election manifesto was stacked full of the dreams of the party's traditional left, so the abolition of the House of Lords, unilateral nuclear disarmament, withdrawal from the European Economic Community, the renationalisation of British aerospace, and all these sort of things. And it's often depicted as a sign of a party where the control has been wrested by the extremes, but that's not actually the case. Michael Foot's logic was simple and supposed to be unifying. All he did was simply adopt all the resolutions that were passed at the party conference as manifesto promises. It was supposed to be an exercise in internal democracy, but it absolutely bombed with the voters. Thatcher won with what was seen as a landslide. The popular narrative is that the public swung to Thatcherism following the victory in the Falklands War the year before, but in reality, although Labour's vote dropped about 10%, it was largely the SDP and Liberal Alliance who picked up those votes. The Conservative vote actually dropped in the 1983 election by a couple of percentage points. But given Britain's first-past-the-post electoral system, which is very unrepresentative, the Tories actually managed to win 58 more seats and gave them the largest political majority since World War II. And Gerald Kaufman, a Labour MP, would describe the 1983 manifesto as the longest suicide note in history, and that is how it's remembered.
However, as usual, it was actually the right wing of the left, the centrists, who didn't do the thing that they're always telling those of us on the left to do and stand by for unity in the face of an assault from the right. And it was their split that actually probably guaranteed Thatcher her big re-election and her chance to completely reshape British politics and society. Our subscribers on Patreon and Apple Podcasts make it possible for us to do all of the work of creating this show and to give out all of the main feed episodes for the show for free. That means our main episodes, our special episodes, and also exciting special projects like this one. And we've got more in the works.
So to help support Bad Gays, head on over to patreon.com/badgayspod or look for us on Apple Podcasts. Subscribers also get access to Extra Bad Gays, a monthly podcast where me and Ben talk about everything queer-related in culture, media, politics, as well as answering questions about love, sex, and everything else from our listeners in our regular Gaggany Gunkles section.
And as we've stated, if you subscribe to Extra Bad Gays, you can always listen one episode ahead to the entire Mandelson, A Homosexual History miniseries. So do head over and check it out. Thanks. This is, of course, the moment in Britain described in one of my favorite novels, The Line of Beauty by Alan Hollinghurst, where he's gone to stay with his friend he's in love with, whose father is a kind of minor minister in the Thatcher government. And he describes all of these, like, Thatcher ministers getting together after that 83 landslide with this attitude of children who've just gotten away with something very naughty. Like they've made all these people unemployed, and they were worried in the first term about all of the tremendous backlash that these changes might set out. And then they feel that they've basically just been handed the keys to the kingdom and they're able to do whatever they want.
Yes, and Thatcher felt the same way. She took full political advantage of her victory. And at this point, she was secretly hoarding coal supplies and she was militarizing her police force in order to wage war on the most powerful of the trade unions, the National Union of Mine Workers. That was led by the union leader, Arthur Scargill. So that led to the 1984 miners' strike, which was this enormous clash between the state and the powers of organised labour. And that was Thatcher's ultimately successful attempt to crush organised labour in order to implement a neoliberal transformation of the economy. And this was enabled in some ways because the Labour Party was in full civil war and the strike didn't help. So following the 1983 election, Foot resigned and the party elected a young soft-left MP, a very skilled orator called Neil Kinnick, a Labour MP, as the party leader, with the Labour right MP, Roy Hattersley, as deputy. So this again was seen as a unity ticket. You have this soft left and you have this right-wing guy. But Kinnick immediately had to face down this problem of the miners' strike. And he felt that if he backed the miners' strike, it would look like Labour was continuing to be the party of industrial strife in the far left. But if he abandoned the strikers, it was a failure of solidarity that would, of course, destroy the labour movement. Now, at this point, it's really a case of your mileage may vary according to your political positions with regards to how well he did with this. He took a position that was essentially a position of supporting the troops but not the war. He attacked the National Union of Mine Workers membership and Arthur Scargill in particular for not calling a national ballot before announcing the strike, and for this strategy of mass picketing and flying pickets, which caused a public confrontation on the TV between striking miners and cops and scabs that Neil Kinnick believed played very badly for the public. And when the strike failed, Kinnick felt vindicated in this position. He decided, urged by the Labour right, to end the Labour Party civil war by purging the left. Sound familiar, Ben?
Sounds very familiar.
So in fairness to Neil Kinnock, which is not a sentence that has ever passed my lips before, he did begin to understand something fundamental at this point, which is that the terms of engagement for electoral politics looked very different in a mass media age. But at this moment, you see the emergence in Labour of a narrative that continues to this day, a narrative that says that the Labour movement itself, its members and the trade unions are an anchor that drags the party to the left, while the parliamentary party, being much more reasonable and rational, needs to move rightwards to appeal to an increasingly right-wing electorate. The right of the party regards the left as naive ideologues, and they say that the main aim of the Labour Party is not to represent the Labour movement, which is why it was started, but to maintain a Labour Party in power. So this is sometimes described as Clause 1 socialism, as maintaining a Labour Party is the first clause of the Labour Party rulebook. And this was in opposition to what is called Clause 4. Clause 4 originally read that the aim of the Labour Party was, quote, to secure for the workers by hand or by brain the full fruits of their industry and the most equitable distribution thereof that may be possible upon the basis of a common ownership of the means of production, distribution and exchange, and the best obtainable system of popular administration and control of each industry or service, i.e. socialism. Clause 4 would go on to become very important in Mandelson's story, and we'll come to that in a later episode. The left of the party, meanwhile, felt that the principles of the labour movement were key, and their aim was to win people over to those principles. So you actually see a fundamental ontological division within the party. One side who believes that the purpose of the party is first to win power regardless of policy and by chasing the opinions of the voters, and the other believes in maintaining policies that help workers, even and perhaps at the expense of winning power. And again, this division exists largely because of this totally fucked up and undemocratic nature of the British electoral system, which is known as first past the post. For a brief recap, the British electoral system is based on members of geographic constituencies, i.e. your local community, vote for a specific candidate for their constituency, and it's first past the post, so that the candidate with the most votes in that constituency wins that seat and becomes your local MP. Now, the major problem with that...
Right, so if 17 people run for that seat, I could theoretically become the member of parliament with 18% of the vote, because 4 people who agree with each other much more than they agree with me each got 10%, and that doesn't matter that altogether more people in the constituency want their politics than my politics.
Yeah, so if the Labour Party, the Socialist Labour Party and the Labour Socialist Party split the vote 3 ways, and they each get 19% and you get 20% as a Conservative, you win, even though clearly most people want something left. So, and of course, on a national level, the major problem with this system is it's possible to win a huge chunk of the popular vote share, i.e. the total votes, yet not win any MPs. So anyone who votes for that candidate or that party receive no representation in Parliament.
Right.
Traditionally, if you lived in a safe seat, but you supported another of the parties, your vote was completely useless. And if you wanted to support a third party in this two-party system, the chance of you having any impact at all was negligible. So as an example, in 1979, Thatcher's Conservatives won 13.6 million votes and they won 339 seats in Parliament. In 1983, they received just 13 million votes, so they lost 600,000 votes, but they won 397 seats, so they got 58 more seats than they had. So even though the popular vote would be moving against the Conservatives, because of the way the constituencies are carved up, they actually increased their majority. And perhaps a more striking example of this is looking at the difference in Labour seats in the 2017 election under Corbyn and the 2024 election under Starmer. So in 2017, Labour won 40% of the national vote, nearly 13 million votes, and they won 229 seats. In 2024, under Starmer, they won just 33% of the popular vote, about 10 million votes, so 3 million less votes, yet they won 411 seats, almost double the amount of seats, even though less people, like a lot fewer people voted for them. So the lowest vote share of any winning party since the war has led to a majority of almost 300 seats in Parliament. Now, both the Labour left and the Labour right are correct in their assessment of the situation. For the left, it is clearly a very undemocratic political system, which leaves millions of voters unrepresented. The country clearly has a strong base of voters who want more representation from the left in Parliament. And the Labour Party right are also correct when they say you have to play the game in order to win the game. The general elections are not decided on the opinion of the majority of constituencies, which are historically safe seats, but it all comes down to this handful of marginal swing constituencies that might go either way. And those, of course, tend, to have more centrist or right-wing voters. And so if you want power, it's those voters that matter. So your vote is geographically weighted. If you live in one of those swing constituencies, your vote is like gold dust and weighs much more heavily than if you live in a safe seat.
And listeners to this in the United States will recognize this as the exact same electoral political system that we have in the U.S. In the U.S., it's even more complicated, and in the U.S., it's even more fixed in those two parties. Also in the U.S., we have something that you don't have in the U.K., which is open primaries, which means that everyone who says they're a Democrat gets to decide what it means to be a Democrat. And that's how someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or someone like Zoran Mamdani is able to win a Democratic primary against the kinds of people that party leaders, party bosses would have rather installed there. In the Labor Party, that's an internal process. That's not a public election.
Yeah.
And it's even more difficult to break through there. But people in the U.S. will recognize Hugh's description of your vote meaning a lot if they've ever had the misfortune to live in a state or a district where there's suddenly a kind of big deal election. I remember in 2012, there was this very weird historical moment when Massachusetts had a Republican senator for 2 years, which like never happens. And so suddenly for the 2012 cycle, the fight for who would win the Senate seat in Massachusetts became one of these big national Senate races. It was the most expensive Senate race in the country for that year. And you couldn't turn on the television for 30 seconds without having someone scream at you about one of these two things. Like the degree of, and then you realize that if you live in Pennsylvania or if you live in Wisconsin, like this is your whole life.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very muddled system, which ends in very undemocratic results.
This is why every 4 years, a bunch of people in France have to learn where Waukesha County, Wisconsin is and what suburbs of Detroit are likely to report results in which time
Yeah.
in order to figure out whether their nuclear umbrella is going to be secure or not.
So this is the bind that Neil Kinnick finds himself in at this time. He needs to heal the rift within his party somehow, but he also has to make it electable. And making it electable doesn't necessarily mean representing the views of the people who join or even vote for his party. He needs a media strategy that can communicate that a Labour government wouldn't look like the Labour Party, in essence. And one way he does this is by hedging his position on the miners' strike, which was a betrayal of the traditions of the union movement, but very popular with swing voters who dislike industrial strife. Another way he does this is by taking on the left of his own party and purging it, which he does in 1985, when left-wing Labour councils refused to set budgets according to new rules from Thatcher, which set very strict limits on councils' own budgets. And that was a strategy Thatcher put in specifically in order to disrupt the left. This was known as the rate capping rebellion, and Kinnick decided it was the sort of rebellion that made Labour look inelectable and governed by the left. And so at the Labour Party conference in 1985, still smarting from the defeat of the miners' strike, Kinnick took to the stage and attacked the militant tendency, which we talked about before, this Trotskyist grouping within the party who had a lot of influence in the rebellion, and he expelled the militant tendency from the party, including people like Derek Hatton, who was the deputy leader of Liverpool City Council and a militant member. As I said earlier, Kinnick is a powerful orator in the Welsh tradition, and he gave a now legendary speech at the 1985 conference. And here's just a little quote from it that explains really the Labour rights opinion of the Labour left. He says, "Implausible promises don't win victories. I'll tell you what happens with impossible promises. You start with far-fetched resolutions. They are then pickled into a rigid dogma, a code, and you go through the years sticking to that, outdated, misplaced, irrelevant to the real needs. And you end up in the grotesque chaos of a Labour council hiring taxis to scuttle around a city, handing out redundancy notices to its own workers." So what he's saying there in regards to the rate capping rebellion of the far left councils is that they become rigid in their dogma and stuck to a position that ends with them having to sack their own workers. They betrayed the working class. So for the right of the party, this was a decisive blow against the left and for electability. It was a big change within Labour. For the left, it was tantamount to betrayal. It was a definitive sign that Kinnick was turning his back on the working class and the Labour movement at exactly the point where they were facing their biggest attack from the right and from Thatcherism. What position you take, of course, depends on your politics. So faced with what he believes is this historic task of modernisation, and in the run-up to his conference speech, Kinnick had decided to recruit to his team a dynamic young television producer as his director of campaigns and communications. That producer, of course, was Peter Mandelson, backed by Roy Hattersley, on whose deputy leadership campaigns he'd worked. Kinnick was initially quite sceptical because he was of the soft left and he regarded Hattersley as pushing up one of his boys from the right. But there's a really interesting moment here in Mandelson's interview with the party's National Executive Committee to get the job. So Mandelson's doing very well, he's answering everything right, but he gets to a tough question about how he'd have handled coverage of the miners' strike. The committee, in general, seems to like his answer, but Neil Kinnick's face betrays the fact that he doesn't. So here's an extract from Donald McIntyre's biography of Peter Mandelson. During a break in the meeting, Kinnick told Hattersley, "I'm still going to vote for Mandelson." His deputy murmured, "I guess you didn't like his answer on the miners." To which, to Hattersley's surprise, Kinnick replied, "It wasn't that. Did you notice his socks? He was wearing pale blue socks. You don't come to fucking interviews wearing pale blue socks." End quote. So this to me is a really interesting and telling anecdote because it's the start of an issue that will go on to plague Mandelson throughout his political career. Nobody in this situation doubts that he has the political and communication skills, but his own personal presentation is seen as this major conflict with the traditional ideas of what Labour men are like. And it's this paradox, isn't it? This man becomes this absolute master of communication and image control, but he can never turn that attention to himself. Peter Mandelson has never been a likeable figure. He's always damaging himself in public, even when he shows mastery with manipulating the image of other people. And partly that's his class background, but I think his sexuality is very much at play here. What's doubly interesting to me here is that the attention to such details is often attached to Mandelson himself in coded queer language in the press and in the media. Like there's something about his queerness that makes him more attentive to these aesthetic and surface details. But actually, he's not very good at understanding those things in a wider public context. And in this anecdote, the shade of someone's socks and the implication it says something about him as a man, it doesn't come from this effete Hampstead garden suburb gay, but from Neil Kinnick, the Welsh son of this horny-handed son of toil coal miner. And it's interesting, isn't it, as an act of projection, and that representations of masculinity are as scrutinised by these impeccably heterosexual males as the gay, even though attention to such details is seen as very much the remit of the queer. But McIntyre also notices quite perceptively that Mandelson's appointment is often represented as the year zero of the modernising project. But in fact, he joined Neil Kinnick's team precisely because he felt the process had already begun. Nonetheless, his appointment was key. Despite his lack of experience and his own acknowledgement that he didn't have a clue where to begin, his own personal project of modernisation of the party was about to begin. But Mandelson did, I think, understand something key about his self-image, which was precisely that although he was personally very charming and he had this big vision for the Labour Party, he himself could never be the face of that transformation. So, given we've covered Mandelson's upbringing within this old Labour Party, and we're at this year zero of the transformation of the party into something new, I think this might be a good point to end episode 1. And in the next episode, we'll dive deeper into the invention of New Labour and its vision for Britain, but we'll also look at how political culture understood and utilised homosexuality at a time when the AIDS crisis was devastating Britain's LGBTQ community, as well as the backlash that accompanied it in wider society.
Thank you for bringing us through episode 1 of 5 of Mandelson, A Homosexual History. We're going to save our questions, our sources, and our conversation about Peter Mandelson for the end of the final episode. And if you can't wait for the next episode of Mandelson, A Homosexual History, it's available right now to our Patreon and Apple Podcast subscribers to Extra Bad Gays. So click subscribe in Apple Podcasts or head to patreon.com/badgayspod and keep listening right now. But for now, until next week, see you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Bad. 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 Bad gays. Bad gays.